All right, I have an Excel file here, and actually, I've done a few things to it. Before I do that, we talk about where this file came from. This came from sheffield.ac.uk MASH statistics datasets. I honestly don't. I mean, I grabbed this because I thought this would be a data set that I could use in my classes. And to do that, I wanted to first start off by setting this up. And so there's a person ID, there's head circumference. This data set basically has some information on children that were born. It has some measurements. I don't really know where the children are or who they are. There's some associated ID, but there's a head circumference, there's a length, birth weight, gestation period for the pregnancy, the mother's age at time of birth, the father's age at time of birth. There are more variables in here, but I just distilled it down to these so that we could do a few of these exercises. And over to the right, we'll start column U describes there's the mean, mode, sum of squared, sample variance, and then letting Excel compute the sample variance. There's the sample standard deviation, and again, letting Excel compute the standard deviation so we can check our work. And this is set up so that students can be able to compute these by hand, have a better understanding of how these work. And I also created these whisker plots, and we'll go through each of these, and I'll show you a few shortcuts too. So first of all, there we have the head circumference is already done. So let's start working on the length. On column F, let's compute the deviations from the mean. And so, like if we look at baby 1313, when he or she was born, this baby was 17 inches long. And how does that differ from the mean? We can use a formula to describe that. Column E has length. There's nothing else in it. If I go to the very top, put control down. That brings me to the bottom of the data set, control down one more time. And the very bottom of Excel means there's nothing else in there. Okay, and so let's compute the deviation from the mean. The formula is equals. I'm going to click on the cell next to it. You could type in E2, but like you let the mouse, it's nice when you let Excel do as much of that work for you as possible. So E2 minus the mean, the X bar means the arithmetic average, the arithmetic mean. So, and the formula for that is average. And I could type in E. Another thing I could do is just click on this E thing right here. And the proper thing to do would be to close it off with a parenthesis. But if you don't want to close it off with a parenthesis, if you leave it there, you hit enter, Excel will ask you, does this look right? You enter again. And so now we have the deviation from the mean is negative 2.929. And if you want to copy that all the way down for that column, where you have that cell selected, there's a little box to the right. You double click that thing right there, and that will compute to the deviations of the mean for each of the observations of the baby length at time of birth. And then the next thing we do is we square the deviations, and we'll use that to compute the standard deviation eventually, but it's one of the steps in there. And you'll notice in column F, you have X minus X bar, and this you have that same thing in parentheses squared. And so you can recompute all of that, but you can just use information to the left, which we'll do. There's two ways you can do that. You can do equals, you click on that cell, put in the multiplication sign, shift 8, F2, so F2 times F2, that gives you the deviation squared. You could also do equals F2 and then use a little caret squared. It's the same thing. And so that gives us our deviations squared. Let's come over here. The length, we can compute the mean, start filling out this table. We want to compute the mean, it's equals average, and that's F. Let me double check. Yes, that's column F. So that gives us that. E, we're looking at E. Sorry, that's wrong. There's some, okay. The difference from the mean for each of those observations, of course, would be 0. But the average length, the arithmetic mean length is 19.929 inches. The mode, you can do the same thing. Actually, I'll show you a little way you can cheat. Let's just copy that down. Control C is copy. I'll paste that in there. Then I'll come up into the formula bar and change where it says average and type in mode. So the most common length at birth among this data set is 20 inches. The sum of squares. So let's add up all of those square deviations. And that is, I believe, column G. Yeah, so column G. I'm going to select G. You could put in G colon G. So now we have G, the sample variance. So, and that's the sample variance gives it a, well, I can copy this formula over here, but the sample variance is the sum of squares divided by the count of observations we have. That was in column E, minus 1. You're getting a population variance, you don't give the minus 1, but that minus 1 means for the sample variance, it gives a little bit of a penalty, a greater proportional penalty for a smaller data set, and a smaller proportional penalty for a larger data set. So we have our sample variance of 1.239. And you can also use the formula equals var.s, that's a sample variance, and we're looking at E. And so hopefully those will both be the same. It looks like they are. And to find the sample standard deviation, you take the square root of that, the square root of the sample variance to give you the sample standard deviation, 1.13. You can check that. stdev.s is a sample standard deviation. We're looking at everything in row E, and the values are the same. Well, let me show you a shortcut. Oh, yeah, before we do that, let's start working on these. So we're looking at, minimum. These are the 5-number summary things that you'll find in a box plot. The minimum is equals min E, that's the length. So minimum length is 17. Percentile, include formula, that is E. And we're looking at the 25th percentile. And then the median equals median. You could also use the same formula, but instead of 0.25, make it 0.5. That gives you the same thing as a median. And I'm just going to copy this formula. I'll paste it here with you doing the 75th percentile. Actually, instead of 75th percentile, you could just do 75%, which is the same thing as 0.75. That gives you the 75th percentile maximum, max E. And there you have it. So now we have our box plot with whiskers for the length. You have the minimum, the 25th percentile, median, 75th percentile, and the max. And if you want to make this really fast, when we set these formulas up, you'll notice that they're not anchored. You put a $ in there if you want to anchor the row or the column. These do not have that. This basically says, give me what's next to it minus the average of everything in that row, in that column, excuse me. And this just looks at whatever the square root of the cell next to it. So we can select these. I'm going to copy these. And you can paste them into here, and you'll have the appropriate. You'll have all of the squares, the square deviations in there computed for you. And then let's see, I'm going to just copy these and paste them over here, and then we'll make some adjustments. And we'll do the same thing over here. I'm going to select these cells. I'll copy them. Okay, but I kind of cheated. I put an H in here. That'll make it easier. And so we're looking at G. Oh. So the birth weight, instead of F, let's put H. The mode will do the same thing. Sum of squares. So where is that? H. J. So that's what we're looking at. Replace that with J. Okay, this is for E instead of F. Oh, what am I looking at? H. So I put an H down here because the birth weight is in column H. Yeah, it's right here. Column H. So it makes it, by having something like this set up, when you copy the formulas, there's a relative thing in there. So it only does relative to that distance when it's copying. And so you have to update where you're doing these from. That's just the square root of what's above. Okay, so G, oh, we have to do it down here too. These should be H. So I'm going to do a replace. Instead of column F, we'll make it column H. And because I have a bunch of cells selected, oh, Control H is find and replace. It opens up this dialog box. And because I only have these specific cells selected, that's only where it's going to be replacing. If you don't have an array of cells selected, it could replace everything in your table, which is not exactly what you want. But because that's selected, it should be fine. So you replace all, all done, made 5 replacements. And so now the box plot for birth weight looks like it should. So let's look at this one. We're going to take G and replace it with K. G with K. The Control H opens up the dialog box. I find the column G, replace it with column K, and that's how they're in Excel. All done. We made 10 replacements. Box plot looks okay. Let's start looking at these. Sum of squared. I didn't like that. Instead of I, we want K. I think, let's see. Gestation is, oh, sum of squares. So K, we want M. Because that's just the gestation period, but we want the deviations. Okay, now that thing looks like it should. This one was already left in here. And so that gives us all the figures we have. We have the mean, mode, sum of squared, the sample variance, the sample standard deviation. We have the 5-number summary of minimum, 25th percentile, median, 75th percentile, and maximum, all populated in here. But actually, yeah, and there, I'll go ahead and end this.